Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. As the world pivots to Asia, China has its own plans for this vast region and the world. Not satisfied with the options of either assimilating itself to the West or facing confrontation, Beijing is creating its own global system. To CrossTalk China's designs for the world, I'm joined by my guest, Richard Weitz in Washington. He is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. Also in Washington, we have Douglas Paul. He is the director of Carnegie's Asia program and was responsible for U.S.-China relations during the Reagan and Bush 41 administrations. And in New York, we cross to Daniel Wagner. He is the CEO of Country Risk Solutions. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Douglas in Washington, D.C., if I can go to you first here. On the way down to the studio, I picked up a copy of Pepe Escobar's article about APEC, and it reads, "The American century is over. The Eurasian century has begun." Hyperbole? What do you think?
I think it's hyperbole. The Chinese are really full of themselves right now, and they're trying to show the world that they are the new leaders in some respects, but they also are nagged at by internal contradictions and self-doubts, and that tends to exacerbate the effort to make China look large on the stage, when in fact, in reality, they may have a hard time delivering.
Okay, Richard Weitz, also in Washington, D.C. What kind of century? It could be the American China or American Sino century. Maybe the next century will be China's.
Right. I think that the lore has it that the Obama administration in the first year was thinking of a sort of a G2 for some issues like climate change and so on, but that quickly fell apart. And there's speculation that, I mean, some of the way that the Chinese refer to this new type of great power relations in the context of the U.S. almost implies a sphere of influence in the Pacific. But that's, you know, it's unacceptable in Washington and the American public. They've always rejected these sphere of influences. And there's just too many areas where we just can't separate each other that way. In terms of one country system or another, that's more interesting. I mean, the Chinese, for at least initially, were accepting a lot of the Western institutions. This is the post-Maoist leadership. They started joining some of the institutions which previously they disparaged. INF, some of the non-proliferation institutions. But more recently, it's true, they've been starting to promote their own. It started with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which, as you know, Russia was a co-founder. Now they're pushing the CICA conference that they've assembled. They've got some other visions that seem to imply a different kind of rules, and particularly with China in charge.
Yeah, you got BRICS as well. Daniel, this is very interesting because it's called Without the West, exactly what Richard was talking about, where we have new institutions that are duplicating, if we say, look in the financial world, the Bretton Woods of institutions. China wants its own. It's creating a parallel universe to Western institutions, liberal institutions at that. What do you think about that, Daniel?
Well, I think there's a certain inevitability about that. I think it also, first of all, depends on your frame of reference, whether it's China's century or whether that's something that can be ignored. If you're Chinese, this is simply from your perspective, assuming the mantle that you had 150 years ago as the predominant economic and political power. If you're American and you're sitting there still at the top of the pile, but you know that eventually that you're not going to be at the top of the pile anymore, it's perhaps a difficult realization that you might have someone nipping at your heels. In answer to your question, China is creating some of these institutions not only because it wants to have greater influence, but because it perceives that the current international regime is broken, and it wants to try to fix it as well as mold it in the process.
Douglas, let's continue with that theme, because over the last 20 years, let's say, there's this been perception coming out of Washington, and I'm glad you're on the program because you've had a lot of experience with China, that, you know, either China assimilates to Western institutions and liberal ideas, or there'll be confrontation. But the Chinese are saying something very, very different, that we're going to live as if you don't even exist beyond your institutions. Is that viable?
Well, I don't think that's quite what they're saying. I think the Chinese have a legitimate bill of particulars against the U.S. and the West because the IMF has not been, we have new funds and voting shares that are to be assigned to China, and the U.S. has been unable to pass it through the U.S. Senate. We're trying to hang on to the structure of the World Bank and the ADB without allowing them to change to meet the needs of the times and the capital requirements of a much more expensive era. So the U.S. is failing. We don't even fund our own Ex-Im Bank anymore. So we've kind of taken ourselves out of the competition. We've got to get back in the competition. We have to figure out how we can, to the greatest extent possible, co-opt the Chinese into the existing international regime. We've had experience of doing this, especially after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, when the U.S. was very similarly postured. It opposed the Chiang Mai initiative. It opposed being part of the solutions bilaterally in the region to the financial crisis that prevailed then. And the Chiang Mai initiative went on to be established. It, in fact, brought itself into conformity with IMF rules, and IMF was able to co-opt it. We ought to learn from that example and try to do the same now. We can use this new Chinese injection of cash into infrastructure and other kinds of investments. And I think the Chinese are looking for some rules so that their money doesn't get wasted. So we have a common interest in that narrow respect.
You know, Richard, I think 2008, 2009 was also a very important time for the Chinese looking at the world, because as we've just heard earlier, is that from the Chinese perspective, a good deal of the world system is broken, and we could use another word, broke. And the Chinese have a lot of cash right now, and if they're going to be involved in these institutions, they want to make the rules. I think that makes perfect sense from their point of view, and it should start from the American one as well.
It is true that in the past they were, although unhappily, they accepted the entrings as rule takers. They basically took the rules of the UN or the IMF or the Non-Proliferation Treaty when they ended up accepting it. But since then, they definitely want to be rule makers. They want to have, we've seen this particularly the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They describe it as their institution, has their principles, the Shanghai Way and so on. And now we're seeing this generalized to other areas. And so it's interesting to see how the U.S. is going to deal with that. For the most part, the U.S. has not confronted China, but hasn't joined these or supported them either. It's almost ignored them, particularly like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and SICA now they're not really involved with. But I'm not sure how long that's going to be possible. So you may be right. There are going to have to be some changes in that.
Yeah, Daniel, it's really interesting because when you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, only a few years ago it was kind of brushed aside as this, everyone pretends the Chinese are on the top, the Russians go along with it, but actually it's getting some traction here. There are financial institutions that are coming around that are being extremely well funded, and that creates a gravitas all by itself here. So, and I mentioned 2008, 2009 because that's when the emerging world lost a lot of confidence in the West because of the way it managed the global economy. China's giving some really viable alternatives now.
Well, it is, and the Asia Infrastructure Bank is another example of that. I've had some insider experience in having worked for institutions like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and I got to say, one thing that isn't really being discussed much is how much power China wields in these institutions, whether they have the formal official voting power or not. Without the wink and the nod of China, a lot does not get done in these institutions, and that includes the UN. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes, whether they have official voting power or not. I think there's a lot of good that China can do in terms of how it chooses to distribute its vast wealth. And I view an alternative to the ADB to be a good thing, for example, because there's no way that the infrastructure needs of Asia can be met without additional capital. So I'm all for it.
Douglas, what do you think about that? Because again, of all these, it's globally. It's just not in Asia. These infrastructure projects that China's involved in. I mean, they really, truly are making an influence on the world, how the world works, and because they're the ones that have the financing. But the Americans are still very hesitant in dealing with them with trade, creating an alternative trade universe without China, which is obviously at China's expense.
Well, it's a more complicated issue. We can't just reduce it to a few statements. The Asian Infrastructure Bank was opposed by the United States. I think that was a strategic and economic mistake. The administration still hasn't owned up to that. They need to come to grip with reality on it. China is working in different ways in different parts of the world. Near its own periphery, it wants more say, it wants more influence. It's a very traditional outlook. It wants a new kind of great power relationship with the U.S. to keep the U.S. potential for conflict with China contained while China tries to rearrange power relationships in its immediate neighborhood. Farther afield, you get into Africa and Latin America, China is active, but they tend to be moving toward the international standards that have been set by past donor nations for aid, or past investor nations through various investment banks, in order to have rules to go by so that they don't founder over their own lack of knowledge of the local scene. So it's a differentiated approach we're seeing from China that reflects a growing maturity. Often I compare it to where we were in the 1950s as Americans, often finding ourselves in new parts of the world where we had very little knowledge and making big mistakes. China has done some of that, but they're quick learners and they're figuring out how to operate. And in many cases, it is not in confrontation with the Western liberal value system that's been institutionalized. In many cases, it's actually quite cooperative.
Okay, before we go to a break, Richard, but you know, China does know Asia very well because they see themselves as a re-emerging power, not an emerging power.
Yes, but they're a little more ambitious than that. They see themselves as rightful heir of Asia. Now they're reasserting the hegemony that they lost because of their century of troubles. And as I'm sure we'll talk in the second part, there are other countries in there who don't fully buy onto that.
Okay, we're going to talk about that after a short break. We'll continue our discussion on China. Stay with RT. Okay, Daniel, I'd like to go back to you in New York. As Richard said at the end of the first part of the program, that China is more ambitious than its immediate neighborhood, and that's absolutely true. And this is where the possibility of confrontation can come about here, because China can build all its alternative structures around the world all it wants, because it has plenty of money to do. But then it gets down, security is something a little bit different. You know, it's very different, as a matter of fact. Everybody lives in the same universe here, and this is what China wants to avoid as it returns to its great status, to avoid conflict. But the United States is there, and there's plenty of people in the region that look to the United States for their security.
Well, that's absolutely right. I think the Chinese are masters at taking things right up to the line and then stepping back and taking things right up to the line again, till perhaps they're pushing the line a little bit further than it used to be. China, although it could be more brazen in how it goes about expanding its influence and flexing its security muscles in the region, it really doesn't have the kind of approach that other countries in the world do, and I think that's to some credit. From my perspective, I think there's a great deal of restraint. Some others may disagree, but for example, even at the APEC summit, we saw China and Japan trying to find a way to break through the Senkaku impasse, and it seems like they may have found a way to do that. So I don't think China is looking for trouble. I think they're flexing their muscles and they're testing their boundaries at the same time.
Douglas, weigh in on that. They're flexing their muscles, pushing the boundaries. How do you reflect on that?
I don't disagree with that. I think there's a lot to it. We have to bear in mind that we have other actors out there. Japan is not going to readily cede its place in the Asia-Pacific hierarchy. In many cases in Japan, there are people who have realistic appreciation of the respective strengths of Japan and China's economies and militaries. In many ways, that in Japan, there are also people who do not. The same is true in China. So what we have to worry about is there'll be misassessment of one another, misjudgment about what they can do. This latest episode of reaching a four-part agreement to permit a dialogue at the APEC meeting is a positive example, but it's a very fuzzy, tentative example, and there are plenty of opportunities for sparks to light a bigger fire in that area. Then we also have Vietnam and Philippines. The Philippines heavily depends on the U.S. Vietnam stands more on its own 2 feet in fighting its own way to resist Chinese pressures. And this is going to be a continuing story, and it's going to draw on the American alliance and its defense relationships with these various countries in ways that will provide lots of friction that will be a challenge for both Beijing and Washington to manage.
You know, Richard, this is probably the greatest nightmare, is that having so many security obligations in the Asia-Pacific area, that it tests the United States here, and having their allies, smaller allies in the region, can, you know, wag the dog situation here. This was risky for the United States. There's a lot of obligations to a lot of different countries.
Well, this is the nature of an alliance. There's the tension between entrapment and abandonment. The smaller ally fears being abandoned, and this is something that, you know, is hurting many people in Japan fear this, and there's been some concern in South Korea. I mean, as you know, China and North Korea are able to develop their military capacity to essentially, you know, destroy the United States with nuclear weapons, so China's probably there, and North Korea may get there. Then there's the obvious question arose, as we did with this during the Cold War, you know, what extent we're willing to die to defend Danzig, or in this case Seoul or Tokyo, and it's, you know, you have to say you will, but there's always these nagging doubts. On the other hand, the Chinese have been complaining that the Philippines, the Japanese, and others are using the Asia pivot, using their American alliances in a way that allows them to feel more comfortable standing up and confronting Japan on territorial questions when, you know, without the U.S. intervention, it wouldn't have occurred. So far, it's been, you know, we haven't had an active military confrontation over these issues, so the balance seems right. But again, it could go wrong either way. If the Japanese feel abandoned, well, they'll also probably get their own nuclear weapons, and that sets up a very destructive cascade in the region. On the other hand, the U.S. really doesn't want to go to war with China over these barren islands. So it's a tough situation.
Daniel, what do you think about that? Because, you know, they're just a bunch of rocks in the South China Sea. I mean, they're not really worth fighting for. I don't think Americans should be fighting for it. You know, Richard's absolutely right here. I mean, this is a very delicate security situation here. But, you know, China feels that it's being hemmed in, and it feels it has legitimate concerns. I mean, the United States can say, you know, this is a security area, and the Koreans say this is a security area, and the Japanese. But what about the Chinese? They should be able to say the same thing, and that's what they are saying.
Well, the thing that those barren rocks all have in common is that there's oil and gas beneath them, or nobody would really care.
Okay.
I think interesting to this perspective is that if you go back to some of the maps from about 100 years ago in China, you see that their own definition of what constituted their navigational boundaries, their territorial limits, you know, stretched all the way down almost to you know, Indonesia and Malaysia. And that view that they have has not changed. I think it's called the 9-point dotted line. They still have it. So from their perspective, they're saying, well, look, you know, it used to be this way. Nobody had a problem with it then, so why do people have a problem with it now? I think America's ability to contain China on the high seas is going to be limited, although China does not have a great ability to project its power on the high seas. It's working on it. And it won't be long before it has substantially more than it does. And when that moment comes, there's going to be a pivot point, I think, because America is already devoting 60% of its naval resources to that part of the world. Can it afford to devote any more? Remains to be seen where that pivot point will be.
Douglas, the criticism of the pivot is that it's the militarization of the Pacific. How do you react to that? Because it just makes everybody else militarize in reaction, particularly in this case, the Chinese. Yeah,
the rollout of the pivot, when it was conceptualized, it was 3 parts: diplomacy, trade, Trans-Pacific Partnership particularly, and security. Bottom line, we would not go below a certain level of capability. But once this thing got into the election cycle in the United States in 2012, all the emphasis shifted to the security side. DOD rolled out speaker after speaker, and everybody got the perception that this was nothing but security related. And it's far from that, but unfortunately we've done damage through bad public diplomacy on this. Now we have to enter a very difficult period. We're coming up to another presidential election season in the United States. Hillary Clinton has staked out a tough line on China. No Republican is going to be to the left of her. And so the climate is going to be tough. We need a team of people who handle China affairs for the United States that's as good as we can get to avoid the kinds of conflicts, to manage the kinds of frictions that are going to take place inevitably. On the other side, China has sort of dismantled the structure of foreign policy making that we've known before. We kind of know what their principles are, but it's become highly personalized, it seems, under Xi Jinping. And we don't really have direct access to people who can tell us his thinking, give us a sense of what would be enough to meet their needs, meet our needs. And so we've got some structural problems on both sides that are going to make the next 2 years pretty exciting.
Richard, going back to China's alternative institutions, but if it really wants to be a player in the security element of global security, then it should take more responsibility. Because a lot of people say, the Chinese, they're really quiet on the Security Council. They let the Russians take the heat all the time, and the Chinese are very quiet. They don't speak up, and that's a big criticism because if they are the largest economy in the world, they want to throw their weight around, but they don't have a very loud voice.
Well, as you recall, President Obama, when he made that famous interview with I think it was New York Times, when he described China as a free rider, that in the case of Iraq or Afghanistan or what have you, and it makes sense, as he said, as President Obama himself said, that they would just want to rely on other countries, Russia to take the lead in Syria on the Security Council, or the U.S. to take the lead in Afghanistan or whatever, because then and their costs are minimized. But not sure if they can keep on doing this. Their global interests are expanding. We're already seeing some changes. They're more assertive on some issues before. Whereas in the past it was pretty much Taiwan and a few others where they really made their opposition clear. So it's changing. I think Afghanistan is going to be interesting because I think that it doesn't look like the West or Russia or anyone else is going to put in the kind of security structure they might want to see. So the question is whether they will try and do it or just try and work out a deal they might have done in the past with the Taliban or something. And if the Taliban comes back into power, at least in part of the country.
Okay. Douglas, I saw you nodding your head. It's very interesting because the Chinese haven't...
Sorry.
Go ahead, jump in. Go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, sorry, Peter. I just wanted to add a point there, and that is that I think the Chinese are actually very deliberate and very cunning in how they approach foreign affairs. They're very happy for other parties to slug it out, as was the case in Iraq.
Yep.
Then they scoop in and grab up all those oil contracts. And that being the case, I mean, if somebody else can fight the battle and you can just sit by the sidelines, why wouldn't you do it?
Why wouldn't you do it? On that point, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love it.